This next question, we ought to give some time for this because it is an important issue for us not only to have under our belt, but not just to respond to, but show chapter and verse where. So, Frankie, thank you for asking this. It is a two-parter. Let's focus on the first one the most. He's a question about why God told the people of Israel to wipe out entire towns, especially the Canaanites. And then he goes on to the significance of why nothing in Jericho was to be touched, if that has something to do with the Nephilim being there and so forth. Let's focus on the first one. So why did God command, as I'm sure the internet has now desensitized this term into non-relevance, but we'll still use it, genocide, targeting people because of their genus? Well, here's the problem. First and foremost, when we're talking about use of words, genocide is an emotive term, something that is usually associated with the Nazis and Nazi Germany. And just like calling your opponent Hitler, making an association with something that's going to cause an emotional reaction is manipulative. So when they say that, oh, Israel's genociding the Palestinians, or they say, oh, everyone's genociding the Muslims and stuff, they're equivocating that term, meaning using two different ways to describe the same thing, but interchangeably as if they are the same word when they're not. They're equating mass killing with murder, which is, again, not the same thing as killing. And then they would also attribute motive and saying the reason they're committing these killings, these murders, is because of their non-Jewishness. So your God-commanded genocide. Why would that be a problem for Christians? Well, speaking for me personally, if we claim that God is the standard for all morality, that he is the objective standard for what I determine as right and wrong, and he's capable of things that are objectively wrong, then in fact the idea of my God, at least, the God that I'm worshiping, is self-defeating. So if an atheist can level a point and say that your God claims this aspect of his moral nature, but then also conflicts with that moral nature in commanding these kind of atrocities, you are worshiping a nonsensical deity. And we'd fully agree if that was accurate. If I believed in a God that never let anything bad happen to anyone ever, and then something bad happens to someone at some time, then my view of God is inaccurate. I'm believing in a nonsensical God. I need to either change my view or remain in a delusion and pretend that those things don't exist. But we don't do that with the Bible. So what is actually happening here? Well, if the accusation is made towards God ordering genocide, then we need chapter and verse, because that is a strong accusation. The first place to go is not in where it took place, the book of Joshua, but the book of Genesis, chapter 15. And if you could turn with us there, Frankie, this is going to be important for your own evangelism as well. Genesis 15 and verse 13 is significant because it is when these nations are first mentioned. Now, just to briefly summarize the 12 verses that came before it and the chapter before that, Abraham and his bodyguards have basically saved his nephew Lot from a coalition of kings in the land of Canaan, where these ultimate quote-unquote genocides took place, and he had the chance to wipe them out after routing their allied armies. But God told him to stop. That's the context of this event.
Right.
Then God renews his covenant with him, an agreement legally between two parties, and reminds him that I'm going to make you a father of many nations. You're going to have more kids than stars. They're going to dwell in this land. But here's the problem. People are living in that land now. So what's going to happen between A and B? Is Abraham going to adopt all of the Canaanites, or is his natural offspring going to dispose these people, or depose, I should say, these people, and for what reason? Let's start in verse 13. It says, he said to Abraham, that is the Lord, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. What's being spoken of here? This is Egypt, the Exodus.
Right.
And since Genesis was written to the people of the Exodus, this was obviously old news for them, but the fact that their ancestor Abraham was told this 600 years prior tells you something. It says, also the nation whom they serve I will judge. See the plagues. Afterward they shall come out with great possessions. See the payment that they provided for the people of Israel after centuries of unpaid labor. But it says in verse 15, now as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, but you shall be buried at a good old age. But in the fourth generation they shall return here, and here's where we get to the accusation of genocide, For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. Now, who are the Amorites? The Amorites were a section of the nations that will be mentioned again in verse 20 and 21 of the same chapter, who made up the people of Canaan. And when God is telling Abraham the iniquity of these people, he's describing a nature to them, an uncleanness that hasn't fully taken root yet. So when Israel deposes these people, it won't be because of their non-Jewishness. Otherwise, they would already be Amorites, right?
Right.
But something unclean about them, an iniquity in them, was not yet complete. What was this? Well, you can look in books like Deuteronomy, which we will in a moment, where it notes their behavior, as the reason they were driven out of the land. And Israel is likewise told, if you commit these abominations, some things including but not limited to human sacrifice, child prostitution, burning alive newborn infants on brass altars,
Bestiality.
and so forth,
Yeah.
they would be judged the same way, and were. See the book of Jeremiah. But when we're talking about this situation, what is Abraham told centuries in advance? That these people, and I'll say it in verse 20, actually 19, to your descendants I have given the land from the river Egypt, the great river Euphrates, the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. Their land is going to be that of your descendants.
Right.
Why? Not because of their non-Jewishness, not because of their Amoriteness or Canaaniteness, but because of what they were doing, not in the moment, but over centuries. Now, here's where we have to read in between the lines a little bit and ask the question, and we don't have to. We'll go to Joshua chapter 2 in a second. But we ask the question, do you think Abraham kept quiet about this promise?
I doubt it.
Do you think that if he lived centuries in the land of Canaan, or not centuries, but he lived in that land, that he serving as a prophet of God, according to Hebrews chapter 11, that he was keeping zip-lipped about his descendants taking you guys out if they continued in these sins?
Not at all.
And we see that trend continuing with the same God of Abraham communicating that to the Ninevites in the book of Jonah. We see that communicated to the Edomites in the book of Obadiah and others. We could note these cross-references. Even Isaiah chapter 12 is all about this, recapping that history. And look that up on your own time. But when we go to these sections of Scripture, and this is what I was referring to, in Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 17, we read the reason why they were entering into the land. Deuteronomy was a collection of the last series of sermons Moses was giving before his physical death, and he would ultimately hand the reins off to Joshua, where these genocides took place. And in verse 17, we read this: "You shall not pervert justice due to the stranger or the fatherless, nor take a widow's garment as a pledge. But you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore I command you not to do this thing. When you reap your harvest in your field and forget a sheaf, don't go back to get it. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and the widow, that the Lord your God may bless the work of your hands. When you beat olive trees, it goes again. Leave some for the unfortunate. Gather the grapes of your vineyard. You shall not glean it or go back to make sure you haven't missed anything. You shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt. Therefore, I command you to do this thing." So notice there is a provision being made in how they're going to handle the land. In what? Regarding the stranger. Now, how would the ancient world, particularly Moses' audience, understand the stranger to be people of the nation of Israel that they don't necessarily know?
Not just acquainted quite yet.
No, it was foreigners.
Exactly, foreigners, yeah.
People who were still living in the land. And when we go to the next two chapters and noting not to let these abominations be among you, this is in Deuteronomy 28, we see that these curses would be leveled on them for the actions of the Canaanites. And again, you can read the whole chapter in detail, what they'll be blessed for and what they'll be cursed for. But here's the real kicker in this accusation. When we level the fallacy of attributing motive, saying Israel was targeting the Canaanites, the Jebusites, the Perizzites because of their itness, because they weren't Jewish, or they at least weren't Hebrew enough. We go to the book of Joshua and we actually hear their version of the story. Why was Israel entering into the land? Because they were a superior force and they were just unfortunately getting overwhelmed by them. And after all, at this point, they had taken out 2 Canaanite kings. On the other side of the
Right.
Jordan River, their names were Sihon and Og. Must have had a tough time in junior high, but he was a big dude, so
Yeah, yeah. You wouldn't want to mess with his bed. Put it that way.
yeah, he definitely had a king-size bed.
Yeah.
But in chapter 2 and verse 8, Rahab, who is an inhabitant of Jericho, which is in Canaan, she was a Canaanite herself. It notes that in the very same chapter in verse 1. It says in verse 8, when they laid down, that was the spies that were sent into the city, that she came to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land. Now that Lord there is in all caps. Why? Because it isn't just the generic term Adonai.
Yeah,
it's
it's a
referring
term.
to one with authority.
Yahweh, yeah.
It is the covenant name
Yeah.
of God. Now how did a Canaanite woman who had never had interactions with the people of Israel until this motel visit know their God? Abraham was in their land before this, and he hadn't kept quiet. It was common knowledge who the God of Israel was.
This is just an aside, but there was also another individual that's mentioned that gets some pretty interesting New Testament press as well.
Melchizedek.
His name was Melchizedek.
He was a
who
Jebusite.
Who was a Canaanite king,
Yeah.
but evidently knew the Lord and was quite an example of what Jesus would be in the future. So,
Absolutely. But going back to the passage, and this is important, she not only names the name of the Lord, but says, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. Why? Verse 10, for we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt. Hadn't kept quiet about the miracles. And what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites. Notice that name again. People who would be morally culpable to the warning Abraham gave. They aren't attacking everyone in Canaan, but these groups that were aware of what God had told them. Who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. We'll get to that in a moment. And as soon as we heard these things, our heart melted, neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you, for the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. And then she asks for mercy, and what do you know? They get it. But here's the point. Rahab, a Canaanite, knows why Israel's here, that God has given them the land. They all but quote the promise that was made centuries prior during the time of Abraham and understand you're here to drive us out. But I ask that you spare my family, and they were. So, and you see in the next 2 chapters, the Gibeonites were also spared. Why? Because they asked for it. But here's the point of emphasis. When we look at those sections, and if you want historical resources on this, I don't agree with all of his conclusions. He came to conclusions about Moses and the anger that he expressed in the wilderness of sin that I think is kind of handling the passage loosely. I'm putting this out just to say don't treat it as gospel. But Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster?, cross-references the language that's used in the Pentateuch, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And when it says to drive them out, utterly destroy them, do not spare men, women, cattle, and so forth, the exact same language is used to describe military victories in the ancient world. There was a battle between an Egyptian pharaoh and a Canaanite enemy of his in, of course, the border between Africa and the Middle East. And it describes how he was able to utterly drive his enemies before him, and none were spared, men, women, and cattle, despite this being a conflict in an open field. Now, why was that? Well, it would be the same kind of hyperbole we would use today in sporting events, saying that they slaughtered their opponents. We don't call the police because we understand
it's
it was
going to
an
be a
overwhelming-
bloodbath.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that's the idea.
Yeah.
What is the language here? We're saying, and I'll justify this more in a moment, because you can just say, oh, you're hand waving. No, I'm not. Understand the point. When we look at other references to that battle, and Paul Copan gives sources for this, The Pharaoh wasn't leading from the front, like his boasts say. He was directing his forces from the back, as most politicians do. He had been driven back 3 times, but ultimately got the upper hand when his reinforcements were in the right place at the right time. It wasn't a complete slaughter, but it was a military victory. So what do you do in the Middle East? You chest thump. You show your authority. You intimidate people so they don't want to go to war with you, because you're not going to spare anybody, even though you wouldn't dream of such things unless you're Hamas or the Amalekites. But the point is this. When you say, but it still says, wipe out, don't spare men, women, and children, and a woman like Rahab was asking to be spared, she thought she'd be a target, don't you see that this is attacking even civilian targets? May not be genocide, but it certainly is unjust. Well, here's the problem as well. When we take this from both angles, both faulty assumptions, the first problem is this. If I take the approach that God needs to judge evil, that God needs to stop bad things and bad people from dominating the world, we hear it at least 3 times a day here on the broadcast, then suddenly God does act, and the iniquity of these Amorites is being judged. They were supporting, promoting, and making it a religious responsibility to do things like child sacrifice, bestiality, child prostitution, and so forth. How could God be so cruel as to exterminate these people just because he didn't like their behavior? Then he doesn't do it, and he says, how could there be a good God when these things are permitted to go on unchecked? There is no God, so it's accursed if you do, accursed if you don't. I rephrase that a little bit. But here's the other issue. If you take the other stat and ask, why did he wipe out all the civilian targets? Tell me, what was the book of Judges all about? The Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Moabites, the Hittites, the other ites, oppressing and dominating and enslaving Israel every chance they got because they had lost favor with God, meaning the people of Israel. They weren't given military victory over them any longer because of their negligence of the same rules. If you actually look at the details, why were there survivors? Why were there descendants? Even in the same passages where it says, do not spare men, women, and cattle. And the next verse goes on to say what? And don't intermarry with them. Well, I'd hope you're not intermarrying with dead corpses and maimed bodies, unless, of course, it's assumed that they're still going to be in the land after you. And here's the point. They have to muddle the issue. They have to make the passage as crystal clear in some sections, while vague and illusory in others, in order to drive home an emotionally manipulative point and saying genocide, genocide, when it's about as reliable as a Twitter post on the event of Israel bombing a military target, when, of course, Hamas has another propaganda stunt to unfold. So here's the point. Frankie, we appreciate you asking the question, but this is what it ultimately ties down to, and you can find other references in this as well. I got my a little pamphlet here that I give to our junior hires when it comes to the issues they'll see on the street. When you look at Judges 13:1, Exodus 17:18 or 8 through 16, Genesis 15:30 through 20, Deuteronomy 24:17, which we read, Deuteronomy 28 in its entirety, the books of Nahum, Isaiah 12, and others, the actual data that we're given doesn't support a genocide because it tells us why they were targeted, and it was culpability for moral crimes after centuries of second chances. And if God isn't allowed to judge evil, he doesn't get the permission to do anything, which is the absurd position that's being leveled against him. The other stat is, if you actually look at the data, cross-reference it with historical sources and the language justified as hyperbole, and of course the internal and external evidence, meaning other ancient world sources and sources in the Bible, don't support the way they're over-dramatizing it in order to make the God of Israel look like a bully and an oppressive genocidal tyrant. It's plain fast and loose with the terms. We'll get to the aspect of the Nephilim and the reason why the objects in Jericho weren't to be touched tomorrow, but let us know if that helps out the first aspect of your question. As far as I'm concerned, that's what I would tell people on the street. Dad, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think the other thing, as far as it not being black and white, as it is usually presented, is Deuteronomy chapter 20 and verse 10. It tells us in this scripture, when you draw near to a city to fight against it, offer terms of peace to it. And if they accept, then again work out a situation where they can again be part of your society if they're willing to do so. So it's not this black and white sort of thing. Now, when the people of Israel got to Canaan, there were those commands given to absolutely wipe out those individuals because, as you mentioned, the land had vomited out its inhabitants. And God played fair. He warned Israel in Leviticus chapter 18, if you do the same thing's going to happen to you. So there you go.